Oh my goodness, we are in so much trouble as a nation. These people are completely out of order and it is beyond all reason. And no, I'm not talking about the young people protesting. I'm talking about the full grown adults that are supposed to be agents for the people running the nation in our places or in our stead, representing us. But these individuals are completely out of order. And if you didn't know that the country was in big trouble, you should know it by now. And so there are a number of things that are being manifested that are bringing us to this conclusion. First, we have these individuals waving flags from other countries and then turning over billions of dollars to these other nations. And of course, celebrating it with the flag waving, completely out of order. And then there has been this Hegelian dynamic that includes instigating chaos among a bunch of college students and then creating this reactionary bill that actually is an old bill that has been introduced in response to the instigation of the college students. And so here you see them so merrily waving their flags for another country on Capitol Hill. The representatives of this country waving flags for another country. A flag is supposed to suggest allegiance. And so, of course, this brings up the question about where is the allegiance exactly? And it's important to also keep in mind that these individuals are agents, meaning we as the people are the principals. We are technically the ones that are supposed to be in charge, and they are representing our interests. In other words, they are working for us. They are agents, so they are go betweens. However, some of the manifestations recently have suggested that they are unclear about their roles, or maybe they are clear about their roles, and we have simply been unclear about their roles. But some of the things that have been taking place suggest that we are in trouble as a nation, not only politically, but spiritually, because some of the dynamics that are going on have these spiritual undertones. Now, of course, this isn't the first time that we've seen this Hegelian dynamic at play, where you have a problem, a reaction, and a solution. The solution, however, actually comes before the problem. So there's a solution already on the table. And then there's the creation of a problem, which leads to a reaction that gets you to the premeditated solution. And so apparently, a number of individuals wanted to pass into law this particular bill. And so what came along with this thing was drafted back in 2023, perhaps even before then, but at any rate, we have it drafted in 2023. And it's sitting there, not gaining enough traction, apparently. And based upon the recent events, this thing was passed by the House yesterday. Now, what's interesting about this piece of legislation that they are trying to get passed is that it is in direct contravention of the United States Constitution. And so it almost suggests that the individuals either don't know the Constitution or they were intentionally acting in contravention, because the bill on its face, is unconstitutional. It's not like something you have to really give a lot of thought to. It's actually in the wording of it. However, it passed with over 300 people voting in favor of this particular piece of legislation. So we're not going to get into the semantics of Semitics. Okay, we're not going to go there right now. What we're going to do is just look at this piece of legislation and then look at the determination from the United States Supreme Court about these types of things. And so it indicates here in this article, House votes to expand definition of anti-Semitism amid anti-Israel demonstrations across the United States. And so in response to the demonstrations of the students, the House of Representatives decided that they wanted to expand the definition of anti-Semitism and also criminalize some of these activities that they have under this umbrella. Now, this is in addition to the civil rights legislation that we already have in place. And so it's very interesting, very odd dynamic. But the excuse for it is that they needed to respond to what's going on in education. So in educational spaces, they had to create this piece of legislation to deal with primarily, of course, the young people that have been protesting on these campuses. And there are a lot of questions about the protests also, by the way. And if you recall, there was an encouragement to, if you have children at the schools that are participating in these situations, you might want to have them come home because it's unclear exactly what's been going on with the protest. And then when you have the Speaker of the House show up on a campus to basically harass the students, to instigate the students to respond, it brings up a lot of other questions, particularly when there is also a call for military and police action against the students that are getting all riled up. And so there are a number of dynamics going on here, but again, I go right back to we are in trouble as a nation. We're going to look at some of the information that's available related to this bill that is expanding the definition of anti-Semitism and some of the behaviors that they want to essentially criminalize. And so there's a question about where is this coming from and why do they think this is a bright idea? And why are they doing something that they know is in conflict with the Constitution? They know that it is in contravention of the First Amendment. Not only the First Amendment, there are some questions about the Fifth Amendment here, the 14th Amendment. So there are a number of dynamics going on here with just this bill that they are trying to get across. Now, again, this has passed the House and now it is going to go to the Senate. And so this is a very clever piece of legislation. This is House Resolution 6090, and it's entitled Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. Yes, 2023. And so apparently they've been meditating on this for a while, and you can see that it was introduced 10/26/2023. But apparently there was insufficient impetus for getting this passed until the students. Okay, so this is post Columbia. And so that's when this was passed by the House. After, again, the students at Columbia were instigated to elevate the protest by the House. Okay, so members of the House showed up at Columbia demanding the resignation of the president of Columbia, who was on Capitol Hill making all sorts of promises that she really was not authorized to keep, and then creating what appeared to be chaos among the students responding to these various House members, along with the speaker. Basically, they were antagonizing the students. And so the students were responsive. And then we had this culmination that recently took place in terms of the actions of the students. And so, not just those students, but students around the country. But again, this is something that appears to have already been in play. And there's some interesting dynamics about the dates and the laws, court cases, and all sorts of things that make all of this very questionable. But again, it brings us right back to that issue of we are in trouble as a nation. And this is just one very small piece of evidence related to the trouble that we are in as a collective. And so the first red flag is that this particular House resolution is pointing to something else for its expanded definition of anti Semitism. Now, most people already have a basic understanding of what anti Semitism is. What people don't understand, however, is what Semitism is. And so that's an interesting conversation for another time. But what they did is they referred to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for this expanded definition, and they wanted to incorporate it into federal anti-discrimination laws. Again, we already have federal and state anti-discrimination laws, making additional anti-discrimination laws related to what they are talking about unnecessary. But they want this to be specific, not just about jobs, not just about public accommodations. They want it to concern education programs and activities, and for other purposes, whatever those purposes have to be. But there is a focus on education. And if you are not aware, there seems to be an attack on education over the last couple of weeks in particular, with quite a bit of derogatory, or use that term because they use that term also here, derogatory information out there about education. Again, focusing on the students, focusing on the educators around these protests. And so they are very much focused with this legislation on education and speech. So, of course, we're at the First Amendment. But when singling out a group for special treatment, then you're going into the Fifth Amendment and you're going into the 14th Amendment. So there are a number of things going on here with this particular House resolution, a number of questionable things. At any rate, you have the collective of individuals that are introducing this particular piece of legislation. And you can see their names there if you want to look at it any further. But you also, if you've been paying attention to some of these hearings, you've seen them bring these presidents of these universities to Capitol Hill and then engage in this bizarre bullying dynamic with respect to these presidents, and then the forcing of them to resign, or pressuring them to resign, or pressuring the boards to get rid of them. So it's just very odd dynamics going on here. And then also this indication of not understanding human development, not understanding the normal behavior of older adolescents, not understanding the behavior of college students, not understanding what college is all about, not understanding normal things that take place on campus, like hanging out on the quad for the students. And so there has been, again, just a really odd dynamic going on here. And the question is, what is this really about? Because embedded in this HR 6090 is this appearance of a total lack of understanding of the First, Fifth, and 14th amendments. And so it's just a very weird situation. And as you reflect on it, you might notice the same things. And again, they have this short title, Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. And so it's very misleading because it almost seems like it's an act related to bringing awareness to something, again, bringing awareness to a group of people, focusing on the history of the people. But this bill goes in a very odd direction once you start looking at what's actually not on the surface, the things that you have to search out in order to understand what it is that these people approved recently. And you can check this out on the Federal Register. And this is just putting forth the constitutional authority for this particular movement. Before we go into this, I want to remind you that I told you quite a while ago to make sure that you have a Bible, not just one Bible, but a few Bibles if you can get your hands on them. Different translations. Definitely, you want to have the KJV because it's easy to find resources for it. However, there are some dynamics related to the Strong's Concordance also that bring into question a number of things. At any rate, the KJV. If you can get an interlinear one, that would be great also, where you have the passages and then you have the Greek next to the English and you have the Hebrew next to the English, along with those Strong's numbers. And so if you could get that, that would also be great. Why do you need to get these things? Well, first of all, you need to have an understanding of what many people in the world view as their guiding book, their spiritual reality. You need to know what that is. I realize that it's very difficult to get through it. There's a reason for that. It's a very trauma-filled text, and so it's not a piece of writing that makes people feel good as they are reading it. That's one of the reasons why when you hear sermons, they cherry pick. Because if they actually just read the Bible from cover to cover, it would be very difficult for people to follow along. People would become discouraged simply by reading a number of things in the scripture. And so there is quite a bit of cherry picking, but you still need to have available for yourself what's in there, because there are a number of dynamics that are going on in scripture that speak to a number of dynamics that we are dealing with. The Bible is an indictment. When you think in legal terms, it is an indictment. It lays out some charges, what it, has defined as crimes, the punishment for the crimes, the sentences for the crimes. So there's a lot going on in the Bible that people don't talk about in that manner, but that's what it is. It's an indictment. And it looks like, based upon this piece of legislation, that some people are thinking about doing away with anything that might call into question behaviors that people are engaging in. And not only related to the Bible, but this can expand to anything wherein questioning, talking, communicating, all of these things can take on a life of criminality, according to what's going on here. So there is this push inside of this act to label a number of things that you wouldn't think of as crimes as against the law. And so the Bible, interestingly, fits all of that. Okay. And so if something like this were to pass and become a law, very clearly the Bible would fit under the definition of a very problematic piece of literature, a very problematic piece of writing. Okay. And those who would repeat things that are in the Bible would come up against some legal backlash. So this is a very serious House resolution that has been put forth. And again, it's just amazing that the number of people that voted for it actually voted for it. And so we're going to, again, look at some of the specifics so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about and why certain parts of this, these parts are problematic. The whole thing is not problematic, but there are certain discrete parts of this that are highly problematic. And so here you can see the voting breakdown, and you have over 300 people voting in favor. You have 91 people voting in opposition, and then 18 people abstaining or not voting at all. And you can check out the record of how each person in the House voted. And so when you look at the breakdown, and we have the breakdown. So if you want to go over the breakdown, let me know. We can go over the breakdown. But the breakdown includes the names of the representatives, the party of the representatives, the states, and then how they voted. And so basically what you have here is the party, the vote ended up with 187 Republicans voting in favor of this particular bill, 133 Democrats voting in favor for a 320 total. Now, apparently, there were more Democrats in opposition to the bill than the Republicans. However, a number of Republicans are the ones that are articulating concerns about the passage of the bill. And so, before we go any further, I just want to bring to your attention the United States Supreme Court case that addressed the dynamics that are in this House resolution. And so, in theory, one would assume that all of the House would be aware of this Supreme Court decision prior to pushing this particular bill forward, particularly given the speaker. So you've got a lot of constitutional specialists around, and they should already know this. And so this Mattel versus Tam case 2017, it made a determination related to what some people call hate speech or derogatory language. The court resolved this whole issue. Now, many people, of course, find hate speech offensive. And you can find many instances of offensive, horrible hate speech. However, it has been determined that if we're not actually talking about some action other than just rhetoric, that restrictions on that by the government are problematic and unconstitutional. However, knowing this, and this is from 2017, granted 2016, and so this has been known for quite a while in terms of recent history. Generally speaking, they should have known even before that. So in some instances, you shouldn't even have to get to the Supreme Court because you can see on the face of the Constitution often what it's saying. Now, there are a number of problematic dynamics with the United States Constitution, and that 13th Amendment is one big problematic dynamic, but we're not going to address that right now. But on its face, you can see that regulating derogatory language, unless you are talking about something that is harassing, something that actually involves harming a particular person, doing something to a particular person. And so if it doesn't rise to that level and it's just someone running their mouth or chanting or singing or whatever it is they might be doing, then generally speaking, it's not going to rise to the level of something that can be controlled or criminalized. And again, the House should already know this, but you wouldn't think so based upon the passing of this resolution. And so here the Supreme Court says basically that the disparagement clause violates the free speech clause of the First Amendment. Okay. And so they made this determination already. Disparaging comments, disparaging things in terms of trademark, those things cannot be controlled with these disparagement clauses. And so they've already indicated that this violates the free speech clause of the First Amendment. And so again, you've got derogatory language, you've got people saying hateful, mean things about other people, to other people. But generally speaking, it doesn't fall under the umbrella of something that is illegal. Again, we are not talking about behavior. We're not talking about actions. We are not talking about someone doing something in furtherance of. We are simply talking about these clauses that prevent people from speaking or direct people to speak a certain way. And believe it or not, there are some sovereigns that do that. And so I guess these individuals in the House, they were feeling kind of lucky or something. Um, and so they were trying to put forth some things that actually exist in other spaces. They don't exist here. And we are talking about the very first amendment. We're not talking about the second, third, fourth. We're talking about the very first one. And they are acting as if they don't even know that it exists. So let's carry on and look at some of the examples of things that they want to have under this anti Semitic umbrella, and they want it under there to indicate what people cannot do, what is not going to be tolerated. And then they have like a little caveat saying, this is basically not to undermine the First Amendment. But that's what it's all about. The entire thing is about the First Amendment. Again, there are a couple of exceptions in there, but they are already covered. And we are talking about some of the behaviors that they are describing. Those things are already covered in existing legislation. And so there's really no need to add on to it with these other things that they have in it. And so knowing that the Supreme Court case is there, they indicate that they want to adopt a definition, this expanded definition of anti Semitism from 2016. And so, again, they want to adopt it based upon this international alliance. And so, this international alliance does go on to clarify what anti Semitism means to this international alliance. However, what anti Semitism means to this international alliance, again, is in contravention of the First Amendment of the Constitution. And again, you can see this 2016. So they reach all the way back to 2016 prior to that case being decided. And this is what they want to use. And so the first thing they want us to pay attention to is that they want anti Semitism to involve perception. And so one of the things they want to do is control perception and emotion and rhetoric. And so, again, we are not talking about the parts that talk about physical manifestations. We are talking about the parts that talk about perceptions. And so essentially, people should not be thinking a certain way according to what they are putting forth. And then individuals shouldn't be feeling a certain way according to what they are putting forth. And then individuals should not be speaking or writing, not saying anything, creating any symbols that indicate that they think or feel a particular way. And this really brings up that whole dynamic with Kanye And all of these various people who were engaged in the behaviors that they have outlined that they want basically outlawed. And so some of the things that Kanye did, things that Kyrie Irving did, um, Ice Cube, just various individuals that became the face of this whole dynamic. And now we have here in place this, what they want to be, this piece of legislation that goes to the very things that those individuals were talking about. And so it's almost like they served as these learning theory models of what not to do and the punishment that would come about for doing these things. And so it indicates here making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or Jews having power as a collective. And so individuals, according to this, will not be allowed, or it would be criminalized essentially, to talk about what they identify as myths about these different conspiracies, about control related to the media, the economy, government, societal institutions. And so you can see how individuals have communicated these things publicly and then been chastised publicly. And now we have this, this piece of legislation that is incorporating all of this into it. And so all of these things would be problematic. Stereotyping would be problematic. Making stereotype allegations problematic. And so, again, this brings up the whole First Amendment issue and individuals doing things that would be in contravention of the First Amendment with these types of pieces of legislation. And so individuals talking about stereotypes, um, that does not rise to the level of a crime, although you do see it as a crime, a sort of crime in some places. Generally speaking, and I notice that some people are really, really sensitive about just sort of hate language or people expressing displeasure with each other. And so people are trying to legislate feeling. They are trying to legislate thought. And you really can't. I mean, you can do whatever you want to do, but people are going to feel whatever they feel. They are going to think whatever they think. And what somebody else thinks about you, I'm talking to whoever needs to hear this. What somebody else thinks about you is really none of your business. If somebody is sitting around dehumanizing people, demonizing people, technically speaking, that's their problem. As long as what they are doing does not directly impact you, then they could be doing all sorts of things and feeling all sorts of things. We're not just talking about this particular collective. We are talking about people in general, because it's not just this that people get upset about, but people get upset about the idea of people saying mean things, period, even if they are not discriminatory. People have a problem with people saying things that they don't agree with. People sometimes have a problem with people doing things that they don't agree with. And so there needs to be a conversation about all of this, but just criminalizing this dynamic is really not the way to go. And I want you to keep in mind that this is all aimed towards education. And so there would not be, according to this, the freedom to even really explore these things. If someone even wanted to counter them, it would be very difficult to have a real intellectual discussion, because you can't even really talk about it in order to get to looking at what's real and what's not real. And so you don't even have the freedom to even analyze any of it. And so this is a major issue. But anyway, this is one of the first things to make note of. Now, this is when it gets really odd, because this is supposed to be a piece of civil rights type of legislation, but then it goes off into the actual state of Israel. And so it says, what is anti Semitism relative to Israel? Well, Israel is not an entity that the country is not an entity that has civil rights. And so civil rights belong to a person. They are rights that are civil, that belong to an individual, a person, a human being. And so technically, we don't tend to think of nations as having civil rights or being covered under the civil rights legislation. It just doesn't fit. However, for some strange reason, the House thought it did. And so there are examples that are being provided regarding what constitutes anti-Semitism with this expanded definition in relation to another country. And so it indicates this is an example. And so it would be with respect to the state of Israel itself. Okay, just keep that in mind. We are not talking about individuals. And so we're going to look at some of these examples. Okay, so here we are with the demonizing dynamic. And so what would not be allowed would be using symbols or images associated with classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. Israelis, that's one thing. A nation state, that's something totally different. And so, again, we are not talking about an individual, a person with respect to a nation state. And so it doesn't really fit neatly under the civil rights legislation. The anti-discrimination legislation really needs to be a real person who has actual standing. Also, individuals would not be allowed to draw comparisons between contemporary Israeli policy and that of the Nazis. And so basically, again, remember this is related to educational settings, but of course this would expand out to other things, have no doubt. And so individuals would not be allowed to do that. Individuals would not be allowed to blame Israel for interreligious or political tensions, for all interreligious or political tensions. And so we've got the no symbols, no images, no drawing of comparisons, and no blaming. These things don't usually pass the sniff test of discrimination or racism, even sexism. They just don't generally pass the sniff test. Individuals looking at, exploring, examining, using signs and symbols and images, drawing comparisons, blaming. It just doesn't usually fit. But here we have it, and apparently the House doesn't know this. And again, here you have this working definition of anti-Semitism that includes that whole rhetoric dynamic. And this is coming from a definition from the State Department. And of course, the State Department should be fully aware that the Constitution has already addressed this and that the Supreme Court has addressed this with respect to the rhetoric part. Again, we are not talking about behaviors. We're not talking about abusive behaviors. We're not talking about harmful behaviors where individual people are being actually harmed. We're not talking about somebody harming someone's property. We are talking about language. We are talking about thought. We are talking about rhetoric. And it's almost as if they want to treat this agreement that they came up with respect to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, they want to sort of treat it like it's a treaty. And when something is a treaty, it rises up to the level of the Constitution, essentially, unless, of course, it violates the Constitution. But that's not exactly what this is. This is some working definition from this particular alliance, and then they are trying to incorporate this international understanding and make it U.S. law. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the illustrations that have been provided by IHRA related to this expanded definition. And we already looked at this one. You can look at it again, but part of this is coming from the IHRA and some of it's coming from the State Department. And some of the examples vary. And so it's unclear what it is what the House is trying to pull in exactly, because they are referencing a couple of things simultaneously, and it's not embedded in the text. And so it's confusing. And so, one thing that they want to prevent is making accusations, again, with the rhetoric. And you can look at the specifics of what they are talking about here. They also want to prevent people from denying things about the experiences of Jewish people. And so, they really want to control the thought of individuals with respect to these historical narratives. And as you can imagine, just like people are all over the place about whether slavery occurred, people are all over the place with respect to the history of Jewish people. And so people are always going to be all over the place, particularly since many people uh, were not in these places where these things were taking place. And so the people of today were not the people during slavery times. And so we really have to sort of depend on what's in the history books. The same thing with what happened in Germany. If you weren't in Germany, you have to sort of depend on what is presented in the history books. But what they are wanting to push here is that people will not be allowed to question things. And again, there are some places wherein you are not allowed to verbalize certain things. And so this is in keeping with that. It's, however, not in keeping with the U.S. Constitution. And here we have another accusing prohibition. Now, this one is really interesting. It's about denying the state of Israel its right to exist. But also, there's this example of not allowing people to identify behavior of that state as racist. And so, again, there is this insistence that individuals not be able to think a certain way or feel a certain way or communicate certain things. And so, as you can imagine, all of the things that the students were doing over the past week or so, all of those things would fall under this type of dynamic right here. And so, blaming that state for anything essentially is problematic according to this piece of legislation. Now, this is when it got really interesting. With respect to the using the symbols and images that we talked about, what would be considered anti-Semitic would be claims of Jews killing Jesus. And so the entire New Testament would be quite problematic. But if you've read the Old Testament, you know that eventually the Old Testament would become problematic. But the New Testament in its entirety would be problematic and is considered anti-Semitic. And so if you look at the essence of the Old Testament, you look at the essence of the New Testament, the constant indictments that are going on in the Old Testament in particular. The entire Bible is just one big giant anti-Semitic book, not just in relation to Jews. It is anti-Semitic in terms of its relationship to all of the different people of Shem, the people of Japheth, the people of Ham. It's just, there's a lot going on in the scripture, but most definitely it fits under this symbols and images associated with things like claiming that Jews killed Jesus. And so that would also be unlawful or illegal. I guess they just have to shut down all of those churches. So, at any rate, also drawing comparisons between the policy of the state of Israel and that of the Nazis. That also would be illegal. That would also be unacceptable. And again, going back to this, we are talking about educational spaces. And so, with respect to educational spaces, individuals would not be able to cognitively even do a contrast, forget comparison. They wouldn't even be able to do a contrast. If you can't do the comparison, you definitely can't do the contrast. And so, basically, they just wouldn't be allowed to think about it, period. As I said, as a nation, we are in trouble, okay? Because I don't think that this is just going to go away. I believe that there's going to be an increasing push for this sort of dynamic. And also, what it seems like is this is not really about the Jewish people. This is really about a geopolitical dynamic. I don't really think that all of this stuff is set forth to actually help the people. One of the reasons why it's not set forth to help the people is that some of the people that are identified, the Israelis, are the ones complaining. They are some of the ones who are drawing the comparisons. And so it creates a situation wherein they can't even self-police or self-criticize or criticize their own government, even from afar, all the way over in the United States. They still cannot make these observations. The rabbis that make these observations, they will not be allowed to make these observations. And so, again, it's just a very odd dynamic. And again, going right back to this whole bizarre nature of the House actually pushing this and passing this and doing it in response to the students. And here you see this illustration being provided wherein there are certain anti-Semitic acts, again, that are considered criminal. And so not just a civil wrong, but a criminal wrong. And one of them involves denial related to the Holocaust. And so there are some places, again, where individuals are not allowed to think in any way other than what they've been told with respect to different events in history, and that's one of them. And so these are the types of things that Congress was apparently trying to get pushed forward here in the U.S. And here you see the illustration related to behavior. These behaviors, however, related to harming people and their property based upon their identity, we already have laws in place for this. So there's no need to create new laws related to this. And this is not the same as the rhetoric. These are Malaman say types of dynamics. They are wrongs in and of themselves. You don't even really have to think about them. You can go to various countries and people in different cultures, and they will tell you that certain things are wrong in and of themselves. Stealing people's things, wrong. Harming people, physically just harming people, wrong. Damaging buildings that don't belong to you, wrong. And so you really don't need yet another piece of legislation to address this. We even have legislation related to doing these bad things in relation to people because of their identity, and that all fits under this. So there's no need to expand any definition because we already have it covered. Now, if you have watched any of the question and answer sessions that they have had on Capitol Hill with these university presidents, you know that some very odd dynamics were taking place, including insinuating that Columbia University would be cursed by God of the Bible. So there's a bunch of interesting stuff going on here. At any rate, the individual who sponsored this bill indicated that this would begin the process of cracking down on the anti-Semitism we've seen run rampant on college campuses across America. Now, this may be happening at some campuses, um, but in terms of some of the harming behavior, the physical harming behavior, the blatant harassment that they are suggesting, I offer to you that that's probably not as commonplace as being presented. It may be commonplace in certain places, and so some people might see it and some people might not. But most college campuses, I offer to you, are not plagued by that. That's just not the way that students typically operate, particularly when you're talking about some of these smaller campuses, junior colleges, state colleges. It's just not the way that students operate day to day. And so there may be some discrete instances, but they need to focus on those discrete instances versus suggesting that all students across America, from college to high school to kindergarten, suggesting that the children are engaging in these behaviors because they are exaggerating. This is not going on. That's not to say there aren't some mean and hateful people in the world. It's just this is just not the norm in terms of schools, and you should know that. You've been to school. And so this individual also, again, wants to get control of any rhetoric related to a totally different nation state on the other side of the world, and wants to control the thoughts, the feelings, and the words of individuals on this side of the world in relation to that particular entity. And here you can see this heading where conservatives are hammering the House, including the Republicans and the Democrats, for passing this controversial hate speech bill. Now, they've given it another name, but that's basically what it is. And again, the whole construct of hate speech, it is generally speaking protected under the First Amendment. And so it's almost like they were trying to circumvent, undermine the First Amendment, get around it, over it, under it, all sorts of things by calling the bill something else, making it seem like this warm, fuzzy learning bill where people would learn to appreciate each other and be nice to each other. And instead, they've got, all sorts of other things embedded in there that really don't have anything to do, again, with civil rights. And it's good to see that you have these representatives actually recognizing the problems inside of this particular bill. And this individual indicated there is some concern about this expanded definition that includes things like criticism of the nation state of Israel and claims of Jews killing Jesus. And so, again, we go right back to the New Testament. And so there are some concerns about turning all of that, basically turning the entire church into one big hate speech. And anyone who has anything to say about the state of Israel that is not glowing, that also being hate speech. And here we have some common sense understanding of that bill coming out of a representative in Florida, Republican, indicating anti-Semitism is wrong, but this legislation is written without regard for the Constitution, common sense, or even common understanding of the meaning of words. I could not have said this better myself. The gospel itself would meet the definition of anti-Semitism under the terms of this bill. Again, this individual is indicating this thing is defying common sense. It is beyond all reason. You have individuals who definitely voted for this, who are in the church, and The fact that they either recognized or didn't recognize or didn't care what was in that bill, it's very concerning because, as he indicates, the gospel itself would meet the definition of anti Semitism under the terms of this bill. The gospel is the New Testament. Then you have another individual indicating that the rise in anti Semitism on campuses is disgusting. However, this particular bill tramples on the First Amendment and it will not make a positive impact on this issue. It's not like creating this particular bill is going to suddenly make the students behave. Now, they have found ways to coerce the students into behaving, but this type of thing is not going to change the thoughts. It's not going to change the feelings. It's not going to change the words of the students or various other individuals. This is just not the way to go on so many levels. And so, whether we are talking about individuals up on Capitol Hill who are representatives waving the flags of other nations, or whether we are talking about these same individuals trying to pass legislation that is in conflict with the U.S. Constitution, in conflict with the United States Supreme Court. Hopefully, between all of this, they will have some time to reflect and realize that this is not the way to go. What they are doing is beyond all reason for the onlooker. However, it apparently is within reason for them. But the important thing at this point is for you to recognize that these behaviors are beyond all reason. And these behaviors, coupled with some other dynamics, point very clearly to the fact that we as a nation, as a collective, we are in deep trouble right now. Very deep trouble.